Elden Ring still has an overwhelming number of spell combinations and synergies even after all of this time. I'm constantly surprised by the combinations you can pull off that can turn even the most mediocre skill into a true boss melter. Today we're going to take a look at one such combo that does both frost and holy damage, but its effects won't just completely destroy undead enemies, but also completely shatter normal bosses. So let's begin. Now the build makes use of two very interesting and separate Ashes of War, one being the Ice Spear and the second one being the Shared Order. Now each by itself is pretty mediocre, but once you combine both of them, the result is pretty spectacular, as in you get the amazing damage, frostbite and stun capability of the Ice Spear, and then further add a holy component to it, more damage, and also the ability to dead the undead with the Shared Order. Basically, this doesn't just work on undead enemies, providing crazy amounts of damage on top of what the normal Ice Spear can do, but it also works against regular bosses in the sense that you do get an extra damage component on top. It's basically almost the equivalent of having a second Golden Vow. And by the way, Shared Order totally works on any damage buffs you might preemptively apply before fighting. In this case, you can totally start with a Flame Gramming Strength, Golden Vow, and then top it off with a Shared Order to buff the Ice Spear to some crazy levels. Now in terms of the weapon you use, it doesn't really matter. I went with a Claymon Harpoon, but you can also go with something like a Partisan or literally any other weapon that can fit the Ice Spear. Reason being is because the spell damage component doesn't take into account your weapon attack rating, but rather its level and the affinity you choose, which is why it's best to choose either a magical or a cold affinity on a high intelligence build when you slap an Ice Spear on any of these weapons. Though I will add that there's a small advantage towards having the magical affinity instead of the cold one when it comes to the Ice Spear damage. It's just a few points of extra damage, but it can definitely be helpful if you're trying to maximize the heck out of this build. Outside of that, we're making use of a Carrion Regal Scepter at this stage. It gives us some nice sorcery scaling, and this is still a high intelligence mage build, so you can totally even throw a Comet Azure in the mix if you want something like that. But on top of that, we're also making use of a seal. And why are we doing that? Well, because we're still using the Golden Vow ability. In this case, about 25 points into Faith is plenty enough to cast the Golden Vow and also get some extra benefits on top, including the possibility to maybe even buff the weapon in case we're going with a non-magical affinity. And a small parenthesis over here with a non-magical affinity with either the Claymon Harpoon or a different weapon. You can totally mix this with a Black Flame Blade, and yes, that Ice Spear will totally add the damage over time from the Black Flame on any target you're attacking, to the point that it more than makes up for the difference in damage that you're losing from having a non-magical affinity for your weapon. It's like at least a few hundred points of damage, but the downside is that you then have to apply the Black Flame Blade every single time, and it also falls off rather quickly after less than 5 seconds. As far as talismans go, obviously we're going with the Magic Scorpion Charm and the Shard of Alexander. These directly buff up the weapon skill damage, and obviously we want to maximize that. Also a Carrion Filigreed Crest, lowering the FP consumption by about 5 points. Totally worth it, since you don't want to like completely waste your mana when unleashing these attacks. And finally, I went with a Source Seal simply because it gives me 3 stats that I really need in this case: more intelligence, more faith, more mind. Totally helpful, and even some arcane in case I want to put a Blood Flame Blade instead of a Black Flame Blade. And speaking of bleed, yes, it totally works with this setup, so you can have both frost, holy, and bleed damage damage all into one mix, but in that case you will want to switch up and have even higher levels of arcane. For example, in this case, as you can see, it takes a bit of time with a low arcane build to create the bloodlust on this boss, but it does eventually trigger from the fact that we're just using the ice spear. I think that that's totally an option worth exploring if you want to mix things up. Oh, and by the way, here is how the attribute points look like. Obviously only 130 in this case, but as I would approach 150, I would probably drop a lot more points into arcane to also kind of fit Blood Flame Blade in the mix as well and have the bleed abilities too. Maybe even drop a few points into intelligence to kind of balance things out, but it depends if you want to lose raw damage versus having that build up on top. Now, in terms of the overall strategy, here is how it goes. Obviously, the two Ashes of War can be put on the same weapon, but you can put them on different weapon, buff yourself with a shared order, and even if you switch from that weapon to a different one, like for example in this case the one that holds Ice Spear, the shared order buff will still linger on your character because that's not a weapon buff but rather a character buff. Again, very similar to the Golden Vow. So here is how you would start before any fight. First of all, you would want to start with a physic tier, in this case one that combines Magic Shroud with the Intelligence Not Crystal tier. This is going to last for a whole 3 minutes, giving you for those 3 minutes plus 10 intelligence and plus 30% boost to magic attacks, which fit perfectly with that Ice Spear. From this point on, you would buff yourself with the Golden Vow for some extra 15 to 20%, and finally top it all off with the shared order from the secondary weapon, which lasts for about 30 seconds. And because you get all of these damage sources, this buffs up the Ice Spear to deal thousands and thousands of damage. Once you do all of that, it takes no more than 4 shots to literally stun most of the bosses in the game with very few exceptions, and it's also likely going to trigger a Frostbite damage explosion for even more burst. Following attacks on frozen enemies goes without saying, that will deal even more damage, and eventually you can just pull off some really nice combos just with this combo right here. Obviously the AoE capabilities of the Ice Spear is not the greatest, but it's by far one of the best for single target damage, making it amazing against any boss encounter. Against regular enemies you can always use a shield in the other hand and just use repost in case they get close to you, and then maybe disengage, follow up with a repost, or maybe even take them from far away using the spell on your weapon. In all of these situations, there's very little in Elden Ring that can pose a problem if you build all of this right. Against undead or death right enemies, it's going to be even more devastating than literally almost anything in the game, because you're kinda doing additional holy damage on top with the Ice Spear, not just the frost damage. And I think that's a perfect combination if you're having trouble with some of these bosses, or if you just don't want to see skeletons completely respawning every single time. Just one shot them, clear and easy, and it's going to make everything a breeze for you even in the end game. This is it with the build, of course. Totally let me know down below in the comments, do you know of any other similar combos between different Ashes of War? I would definitely like to also know your opinion of this build, or if you have used this combination before. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.